Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. When President Trump endorsed John E. Sununu in New Hampshire's high-profile U.S. Senate race, it was met with a bit of a shrug from the one candidate it could hurt the most, former Senator and Ambassador Scott Brown. He says the president will not clear the field, and he's in this primary for the long haul until September. Senator Brown is our guest this morning on Close Up. Senator, thanks for being here.
It's great to see you again. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with this endorsement and the unique sort of dynamic evolving around it, because as I just noted, you were saying, all right, we're moving on from this. He's got the endorsement, though. It's big. We're not going to sugarcoat it there, but you still have some of the Trump base with you, some of those passionate supporters on your side. Nonetheless, how do you overcome this obstacle?
Well, first of all, the president's going to do what he's going to do, and the fact that he did that, it actually, from what I'm hearing around from the base that you just referenced, it's kind of a slap in the face, because you had the original Never Trumper, voted for Kasich, was with somebody else, called Trump a loser. To get that endorsement, they're like, we worked very hard for the president, so why? And then they're saying, well, now he's going to have to explain to the people how he got the endorsement. But more importantly, when the president says jump, John's going to have to say how high, and that's how it is there. And what it's done unexpectedly is it's opened up a lane with the independents, who quite frankly will determine who controls this election and who wins the election, to say, yeah, Scott, you're actually the only one that's actually independent. You know, and I've always called balls and strikes, whether it's with the president or anyone else. We're fully staffed. We have almost $1 million in the bank. We have a lot of the MAGA base. We have the military. We have the people that voted for me before when I stopped the Democrat supermajority, when Kennedy died, and it's been fun. I actually look forward to getting out and campaigning every day.
You think the retail aspect of this can carry you through even to September?
Yeah, of course. And like I said, we're fully funded. We could not raise another dollar, and we'll have plenty of money. But more importantly, we're finding a coalescing around with those independents, with the military, with the grassroots, with people that voted for me, you know, on not only in Massachusetts, but here in New Hampshire. And once again, I don't see John anywhere. I'm going to outwork him, and no one, as you know, you've known me for a while, no one is going to outwork me.
The Epstein files are lighting fires all over the political landscape right now. There's, of course, this mention in one email from Jeffrey Epstein to an associate of Bill Gates. They're talking about some overseas conference, and the email says, quote, John Sununu has good stories. We don't know what John Sununu he's talking about. Sununu campaign has condemned Epstein and said this is a complete fabrication. But how do you see this? Is Senator Sununu open to legitimate criticism based simply on this mention in an email?
Well, there's two different standards. There's the rich, the powerful, the elite, the Bill Gateses, the Clintons, the Sununus, and others who are right here. And then there's the rest of us. And you look at it, and what I'm hearing as I go around is like what's up with that? So you look at little old New Hampshire. We have Maxwell is actually hiding out here. And then we have, you know, Dean Kamen, you know, going to the island, having this relationship. And then we have a reference to John Sununu. So why? And so did he ever meet him? Where did he meet him? What did they talk about? What was the relationship? None of that was answered. It's just, oh, it's a fabrication. It's a lot. He needs to answer, like, quite frankly, everybody, including the president, anyone who's referenced in those documents. And I commend the president for signing the bill to get it out there. I don't think the Justice Department is doing a good enough job getting him out quickly, like they said. But I also think it's important to protect the rights of the victims, to make sure that you don't, you know, obviously hurt them even more.
Are you going to make this an issue in this campaign?
No, I don't need to. The people in New Hampshire will do that. I don't need to. Did he meet him? Where did he meet him? Did he meet him at Davos when he was the head of the working with the World Economic Forum? That's up to him.
Now, Epstein was plugged into a lot of big institutions in Massachusetts. Obviously, you were in Mass back in the day, from 04 to 13, and a VIP. He was trying to collect those people. Did you ever have any interaction with him?
No, I don't have any knowledge or any interaction with Epstein.
You know, the real problem here for Sununu isn't potentially necessarily in the primary. No matter what happens, if he's the nominee, you can see the Democratic super PACs just hammering away at this issue. Do you think that's going to be a problem for the Republicans?
I think it's going to be a problem for anyone associated with those files, and he's obviously referenced, and he's going to have to answer those questions. But when it comes to the actual primary, I mean, we have a plan and we're executing it, and it's going really well. And we're very excited. I mean, look at what happened with Chuck Morse and Don Bolduc. You know, the D.C. elites and all the swamp people, they chose who they wanted, and it didn't work out well. We're getting that same feeling here.
Let's turn to some local issues. Do you support the Trump administration's effort to put an ICE detention facility in Merrimack?
Well, what I'm a little bit confused about is, like, did they tell the governor? Did the governor know? And then when they sent the so-called economic impact report, it referenced Oklahoma. So I'm a little confused like where we are. But more importantly, before we talk about doing shovel one or anything, I've actually spoken to some of the people that work at these types of facilities here in New Hampshire, not the ICE facilities, but our jails, and they're tremendously understaffed, and there are very serious safety concerns. Obviously, it's a local issue. It's up to the Merrimack, and it's up to the governor, and I want to have more information, quite honestly, like everybody else here in New Hampshire.
Do you support the concept, though, that it should go specifically in that warehouse in Merrimack?
No, I don't have enough information on that. As we see, we're just finding out what's going on.
So the town doesn't want it, right? Obviously, we heard from the administration testifying before the Homeland Security Committee that they are not going to back down on this. If you're in the U.S. Senate right now, shouldn't you be taking a position? I mean, Senator Wicker in Mississippi fought it and got it stopped.
You just said that. If I'm in the Senate, I would absolutely take a position. But once again, I only take positions when I actually know a lot about it. I just found out last night about, some of the back and forth between the economic impact report, who got this, who didn't get that. But obviously, if the town doesn't support it and the state doesn't support it, of course I'm going to work very hard to make sure it doesn't happen, just like Senator Wicker.
Now, you mentioned the document, the references to Oklahoma, a sales tax. It doesn't appear they put a lot of thought into this at all.
That's one of the things that bothers me.
But can you trust these people to actually operate an immigration prison if they can't even put together a document?
It seems half-baked. It seems like the left hand is not talking to the right hand. And I would want, as a member of Homeland Security previously, I want to get back on Homeland Security and make sure we address those types of things. One
more question on this. It seems like two things can be true right now. The American public voted for mass deportation of illegal immigrants. They don't want them in the country. They want, this situation dealt with. And yet, people also don't necessarily want to have these pop-up prisons in their backyard. It might be a contradictory position, but that's how voters are sometimes, right? Well, the governor said last week that it's really not her responsibility to try and solve this problem for the administration, but shouldn't the top officials be working harder to maybe put this in a place that could benefit more, that there's more space around it, and that it's not in such a hotbed of potential opposition like it is in Merrimack? Yeah, of course. It would be great if everything went smoothly, but bottom line, it's not. So we have to have, good level heads, solving this problem. I hope the governor and the people in Merrimack and our elected officials right now do that. And if I'm there, I will absolutely do that as well. We spoke about ICE operations the last time you were here in November. Since that time, 2 people obviously died in Minneapolis in very difficult situations. A lot of public debate around that. Do you think the tactics being used by ICE in Minnesota were appropriate? Well, I'm glad that Holman's actually reducing that and stopping that operation. I think we could do it better, but if we look at why some of these things are happening, remember, under Obama, like 3 or 4 million people. Under Clinton, 2 or 3 million people. Under Trump, right now, it's about 650,000 to 1 million people being deported. The detainer issue. We have people in our jails right now that citizens are fighting to protect so they don't leave. If we had an agreement where they have had in the past where we're actually, hey, we have somebody, we're notifying you, we want them, just hand them over. It's a solved problem. So, yes, we need to find a better way to have the cities and towns communicate with our federal law enforcement officials to get these people who are hurting and killing our citizens out of the country, just like has been done in previous administrations. The Save America Act, proof of citizenship necessary to vote, obviously for people registering under this situation, and New Hampshire's already moving forward with this, but you're going to need something serious like a birth certificate, a passport in order to be able to register. I'm curious, a lot of people have said this is a high bar and they want election integrity and security, but what about a situation like a woman whose maiden name is different from what is now her legal name, and these documents don't match up? Well, that's not required on a birth certificate for her to change her birth certificate as a result of that. Licenses and documentation is required everywhere. And in New Hampshire, because you've covered it, some of the people question the integrity of our voting system and the integrity of some people that are actually voting. I support, unlike Chris Pappas, the ability for people to actually go and when they walk in, and all the citizens of our state know that these people are legal U.S. citizens and they can vote. I support the SAVE Act. Chris Pappas does not. He does not support, as we referenced back to ICE, the qualified immunity for our law enforcement officials. And I don't think it's an issue. And if there are people like that, then we should have a system in New Hampshire and in our federal government to help those people so we can get that documentation. Let's go to some foreign policy here. Obviously, some huge things going on there in that arena as well. The attack on Venezuela to remove Maduro. If we see that country start to teeter towards chaos, is it America's responsibility to fix it now? Well, first of all, President Trump started the bounty or the reward. President
Biden increased that, and President Trump increased it again. So I support actually what they did with Maduro. I think that's appropriate. One of the things I disagree with the president on is I don't think we should be running Venezuela. Right now he's trying to work, unlike what happened in Iraq, that vacuum that was created, work with the people that are in there now. Obviously, the Venezuelan citizens will have an opportunity to speak up and work very hard to make sure they have a government there that they know and trust. But he was a bad person. He was exporting, obviously, drugs and really terror in that region and around the world. And I think it's going to be a regional solution, working with our partners and the partners of Venezuela to get that resolved. Once again, Chris Pappas didn't support that effort and never will support anything that the president's going to do when it comes to making our country safe and secure, and that's one of the main reasons I'm running.
What about what's going on in Iran right now? What are the appropriate steps? Obviously, if America intervenes, it could make things better. It could make things worse, potentially. We see a huge military presence developing there. What should the president do to ensure the best outcome for the people of America and hopefully the people of Iran as well?
Well, first of all, I supported the attack on their nuclear facilities. I thought it was appropriate. Once again, to draw those comparisons, which I think the people in New Hampshire need to do. Chris Pappas didn't do that. He didn't even commend our men and women who pulled off that mission. So what that did is, and I've been to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Israel, Dubai, Jordan, and I know that region as an ambassador. I'm the only one that with that ambassadorial experience. I dealt with the Iranian ambassador in New Zealand, and they only know power. And they export terrorism around the region and the world, and so we've eliminated that potential problem. So what should we do? We should, I think the president's actually accurate in bringing that armada there to show that, hey, if you continue to murder and torture and export that terrorism around the region and the world, there's going to be consequences. And the people in the region and the countries in that region, they actually support a lot what's going on because they're the big bullies in the region. And that's one of the main reasons that that region is unstable. And once again, compared to John and Chris, I'm the only one with any foreign policy experience dealing with these things, and I look forward to using that expertise to help if I'm, in fact, elected.
If Trump can cut a deal that diminishes or potentially eliminates their nuclear capability but leaves the regime intact, is that worth taking?
That's up to the citizens. There's a tremendous amount of revolt, and I think it's not over, obviously. And obviously, to step back, Iran's going to do whatever they can do to cut a deal, but then they're just going to go back. I think, and I would trust, and I would hope that there's a regime change there, and it's done in a manner that doesn't leave a vacuum like it did in Iraq. Sorry.
All right, Senator Brown, thanks for your time on Close Up. We always appreciate it. We'll see you out there on the trail.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and when we come back, social media and the race to the bottom in political discourse. Community leaders respond to a post from the White House that draws bipartisan condemnation.